Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg. And in the video today, I'm going to be talking about how Christians should handle and view political discussions. And I'll give a couple disclaimers up front. One is I have only ever lived in the United States, so that's really where I'm going to be coming from with that. And, I know that politics in other countries function differently than the United States, but I think that a lot of the principles I'm going to be talking about can apply to other countries as well, but mostly coming from an American perspective. Another thing I wanted to clarify, this video is not made in reaction or response to any political event that may be in the news when I upload this. I'm recording this a decent bit in advance from when it's going to be uploaded. There's not been anything in the news or that's happened where I thought I need to respond to that. So just wanted to make that clear. I didn't want anybody to take it as a commentary on anything that's happened recently or anything like that. I just planned this a little while back, and this is kind of just when I kind of felt led to upload it. And so just wanted to clarify that. And this is a video that naturally it's kind of a thorny subject. And to be honest with y'all, leading up to recording this, I kind of thought, oh, I am not excited about recording this. Just because, again, I know how sensitive of a subject politics can be. But I think that this video and this discussion is very needed in terms of, what we should keep in mind from Scripture when we approach political discussions. And this video isn't necessarily going to be about, going through all the different political issues and saying, here's the most biblically, accurate view on guns or abortion or different things like that. I'm not necessarily doing that. In this video, I'm mostly talking about, how should Christians in general approach politics when they form their views about anything, and what we should keep in mind when we do articulate our political views with others. And so politics is something that affects all of us to some degree. And, a lot of Christians will share their political views as well. And honestly, I think that when it comes to politics, this is an area in the church in general. It's not specific to any church or denomination. I just think the church as a whole, there's kind of a deficiency when it comes to how a lot of people engage political discussions. I've seen people that are otherwise, seemed very dignified and wise that, might become very childish and bitter when politics come up. And again, I'm not speaking of any particular person or group or anything like that. And I'm not necessarily, saying people I know or, celebrities or, I'm just saying society as a whole. And I think that we need to know how to approach politics in a way to where we don't allow it to bring out the bad side in us, because unfortunately, I feel like politics is kind of an area where a lot of people put do unto others as you'd have them do unto you on the shelf, and that's kind of unfortunate. So I hope I can contribute something meaningful and helpful here with this discussion. And, so there's kind of a few different things I wanted to talk about. And, when it comes to, first thing I want to talk about is kind of, kind of how politics is presented and, when it comes to the media and everything. I've seen, and again, this is across the board, this is conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, I see people across the board that can fall into this, and some that don't. I definitely want to acknowledge that as well. But, I've seen situations where, maybe political commentators or people on certain news stations that, it seems like, they're more interested in trying to be comedians, or to, be entertainment than just saying what happened and giving a thoughtful analysis. And this can kind of give a distorted image of what actually is going on, and it can foster more division. And I think that there's also become kind of a reality show complex, with the news and political commentary, where there's an effort to try to make what's happening seem more interesting. And I saw an interview with a former politician who's not alive anymore, that he was talking about this, that he was saying that, when it comes to things like that, of how politics in the news is presented, there is kind of that, at least among some, kind of motivation of, we need a lot of people to tune in, and so we need to give them a good story. And sometimes maybe the actual, just straight story of what happened is kind of boring, and so people kind of try to spice it up a little bit. And I'm not necessarily saying that, everybody's a liar, or, anything like that, or, deliberately make things up. But I think sometimes people will, can fall into, things like that, where they try to spice things up a little, to get more people to tune in. And I think that, and I'm not just like slewing like, news channels or different things like that. I think that that's a societal problem. I think that a lot of people in general, in any walk of life or any career, can fall into that, where, a really juicy story that they can gossip about can seem really exciting, but there can be adverse consequences to that. Again, it can kind of distort what's going on. And, there are some Christians that will very much agree with what I just said, and they'll talk about, these news stations or this kind of media is corrupt and all that, and are biased. But, I think that, again, whether you're liberal, conservative, somewhere in the middle, whatever, everybody is subject to bias, because all of us are flawed and imperfect. And so I think that that's important to think about. And, in U.S. history, there were a lot of newspapers earlier in U.S. history that actually would openly advertise what political party they were aligned with. They would put it in the name of the newspaper. And so, in some of my research I've done as a historian, they might say, the such and such Democrat, or, Republican, or there was a Whig party at one point, so you might have, the such and such Whig or whatever. And so, again, any kind of source is going to be subject to bias, and, maybe just some of them are more obvious than others, but, everybody is subject to bias, and none of us are perfect. And I think that should encourage us to have some humility too. And, I think that, kind of going along with that, social media can sometimes give us an even more distorted view of what's happening, because, at least sometimes it can be easier to fake stories, and for those to spread faster. And people can be a lot bolder on social media when they can just type something up and they don't have to say it to your face. And, kind of another area I think it's important to talk about with political parties. Again, like I said, I'm not hopping on here to tell you to be this party or that party and everything. I think that ultimately, we have to use our conscience in everything and let God guide us, and, compare what, current politics and parties are saying, compared to what the scriptures say. And I think that political parties are another area where we can see a lot of division and contentiousness. And this also isn't unique to today, as we can see a lot of political division as far back as the election of 1800. And, where there were people that got physically violent with one another. And the following years after that, Aaron Burr, who was Thomas Jefferson's first vice president, shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. And so, that kind of goes to show that, while there might be a lot of tension today, that kind of goes far back. And again, that's another thing. It's not unique to politics. We as people can be very divided and have a lot of hostility towards one another. And, it's understandable that we might have a leaning when it comes to political affiliations, and even a strong leaning to a certain political party or group. And that might not necessarily be a bad thing. However, there are certain things we need to keep in mind. First big thing we should keep in mind is, while we may feel that our chosen party is on point with most things, we need to realize that political parties are not infallible. Political parties have shifted their overall views on certain issues over time, and have sometimes outright completely switched to the opposite view over time. And that's evident when you look throughout the history of a country like the United States. And so, even if you completely agree with everything your chosen political party says today, chances are you wouldn't agree with everything the party has historically said throughout the entire history of its existence. And a big reason behind this is because political parties are made up of and run by fallible, flawed people. And, on the other hand, God and His Word are perfect and don't need changed. And so we need to make God and Scripture our primary basis for all things pertaining to morality, including our political views. And so, ultimately, again, maybe you say, okay, I get that, but I still feel, a strong leaning towards this certain party. I feel like they're on point with most things. Okay. That's where your conscience has led you. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but ultimately we need to realize God is our perfect source first, and we need to follow Him. And the cards kind of fall where they do in terms of what people or groups we agree or don't agree with. And so essentially, it's kind of let your faith and relationship with God, guide your affiliations in that way. Let that be your infallible guide. And, there's this mentality today that you have to go along with everything your party says. And, you have to vote for everyone they nominate, regardless of who it is specifically, or else you're a traitor. At least in some settings, people have that mentality. And, that can be a dangerous mindset because, again, political parties aren't infallible. There's a good chance that a political party is going to be wrong about something, even if you feel they generally have the right view on most issues. And when we get to a point, and again, this applies to wider society too, not just politics, but certainly it does apply to politics, is we shouldn't get to a point where we just blindly follow a group in society, and blindly follow people, and just listen to whatever they say. Because even if they're well intended, they might lead you astray unintentionally. And so, ultimately, again, we need to follow God first, because He'll never lead us astray. And, if we have to, on occasion, say, I generally agree with this group, but on this issue, I kind of have to see it a different way. They might say, different insulting things about you. Or what happened? I thought you was one of us. Ultimately, from a Christian perspective, there are going to be people that say things about us that aren't very flattering. But we need to remember that in Scripture it says, if God is for us, who can be against us? So we need to be concerned about, are we in line with God and His Word, and not, these various political groups that we generally feel like we fit into. And so I think that that's an important perspective to have. And, there were times where, people would even accuse Jesus of not being legitimate, in certain ways, and would insult him and everything. But he didn't change how he acted or what he preached to please other people. And, when we really can see and feel in our conscience that God's word is saying something is true, we really need to stand on that, because that's an eternal truth. And, this kind of ties into our role as individuals. We can see that a lot of what's behind the divisiveness and bitterness of politics has been around since the beginning, but they've been amplified through different means like technology and the internet and everything. And like I said in the previous video on technology, those mediums aren't inherently good or bad, it's how we use them. But unfortunately, sometimes we can use them in malicious ways. And it makes it important for each of us to self-reflect. It's so tempting for some to just blame the media or blame the politicians or blame the party leaders, but we as individuals can contribute to the problem of divisiveness and, and bitterness. And we need to realize that how we behave in these settings is important, because Jesus says that his followers will be known by their love, and we're told about the fruit of the Spirit. And, we all make mistakes for sure, but people can't read your mind, and how we strive to live is a testament to what we truly represent. And, so here are some things we can do and not do in order to help. We don't necessarily have to avoid political discussion altogether. That's something I want to kind of talk about first before I go into the specific things we should do and not do. In a passage I want to read that illustrates that point is Matthew 22, verse 15 through 22, that says, "Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know that thou art true and teachest the way of God in truth, neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness, and said, Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he saith unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. When they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way." And so we see Jesus answered a question about paying taxes to the Roman Empire, which would definitely be considered a political question. So Jesus did answer that. And so Jesus shows that sometimes we can give straightforward answers to what we believe politically. And, this might also be necessary because people want to try to say that religion and politics, religion is political, and they, lump Christianity into that. Although we see Jesus ultimately highlighting spiritual living over earthly politics. And so, this could encourage us to maybe, take opportunities where people bring up politics to us and ask us about our views, to witness to them and tell them what we ultimately represent. So, overall, this passage, shows that there is a place for talking about politics. We don't necessarily, have to be completely deprived and, never, touch anything political. And again, sometimes it's necessary, but ultimately it needs to come from a framework where God is our number one and we're seeking Him first. And so, in terms of things we should do and not do when it comes to articulating political views, is number one, we should avoid childish behavior and we should strive to be thoughtful. We should avoid doing childish things, like picking at people, just for the sake of trying to rile people up. People with different views, like just trying to start fights with them, or posting things on social media that's like just meant to rile people up. Again, as Christians, when we share our views, no matter how thoughtful we try to be, there's always going to be somebody that takes offense to it, and we can't control that. But we need to make sure our intention isn't just, man, I bet I could get a rise out of so and so if I said this or that, and then, we start smiling and laughing to ourselves at the thought of causing drama. We shouldn't do that. And, people might post on social media, maybe there's a certain politician they don't like. Maybe they feel like they really missed the mark on a lot of political views, but instead of just saying that, they'll post like unflattering pictures of them and like Photoshop clown wigs on them and, things like that. And when we do things like that, the only thing we're really doing is just stirring up more division and trying to make people mad. And, and it leads to more of this bitterness and division. So I think, if you're going to be sharing your political views, face to face or on social media, and again, I can't tell you to do that or not or how often. That's kind of just something that, you kind of just have to seek God and, on those things. But I think if you are going to be sharing your political views, it's good to do so in a thoughtful way of, if you feel like a certain politician or a certain action is missing the mark, just say that of, I think this wasn't the right call. Here's why I think it. And again, there's still going to be people, no matter how thoughtful you are, they're going to be like, that's dumb, and, things like that. But I think that ultimately when we share our political views and our critiques, it really needs to be driven by that of, I want to give, a thoughtful analysis of, this is just the way I see it. I think that this is the right view, and I just genuinely want to share that perspective with others to hopefully help them. That's the mentality we need to approach these things with when they come up. And to be honest, I think if we could just do that, that alone would solve a lot of these problems. And, there are other things I'm going to talk about, but I think that alone would change a lot of things for the better. And, I've looked back at, older, presidential debates from, like the 1960s and, things like that. And, interviews on TV of politicians from, decades ago. And certainly people disagreed, but they did so in a way that was a lot more civil. It was about talking about ideas, and they critiqued each other, to be sure. But again, the heart of it was more about, sharing, this is how I see it. I don't think that's the best idea. And, you didn't see as much personal attacks. I'm not saying it didn't happen at all. Like I said, back to the election of 1800, there was a lot of division. But I think that there are also some great examples that we can look back to that, are kind of models for how much more productive we can be when we avoid some of the childish behavior we can fall into, especially when things like, when we hop on social media and we don't have to say things to people's face. When we avoid those things, we can have more productive conversations. And so I think that the second thing that, we should avoid is we should avoid getting into, spreading rumors. And it can be tempting when we hear something shocking to want to go and tell everybody, but we need to be careful with that. There are a lot of people that, when there's some kind of rumor about a politician they don't like that makes them look bad, I think sometimes a lot of people can fall into, they hope it's true. They hope that, you know, it's really bad because maybe that'll get them into trouble. Maybe they won't win the next election. Maybe they'll get thrown out of office and things like that. And, I think it's something we need to avoid where, we get to a place where when we hear that there's some kind of scandal about a politician that we're not the biggest fans of, where we should avoid getting to a point where we get excited when we hear about that, because the prospect that it can mean something bad for them. And, again, if they do something that's wrong, we obviously can have an opinion about that and, and have like a thoughtful analysis of that and say, should this person get my vote when the time comes for that and everything. But, we need to be very careful, and we shouldn't hope that, I hope this person is as bad as possible. And I think we also need to be careful with spreading stories about people when we don't know if they're true or not. And, again, this is another area where I think a lot of people ignore do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, as Jesus taught. Because when you think about it, how would you like it if someone who decided they didn't like you came down to your work and they started spreading false rumors about you that you were stealing stuff or harassing people to try to get you fired? You probably wouldn't like that. And so I think that we need to be careful to not be like that towards others in these political settings. And that kind of leads into something we should do, which is pray. If we really think that someone is wrong in their political views, or that a certain politician, is going down a road that they shouldn't, we should pray for them. We shouldn't want them to be humiliated or to become worse and worse, or that, something horrible happens to them. We should hope that they change and become better. And so, so many people on both sides of the political aisle call for politicians, to face these horrible, situations and consequences. And again, maybe there are some times where there is a call for that. But I think, some people, hope that these politicians they don't like step out of line and do something insanely illegal just so they can face some sort of really bad situation. And, we shouldn't want that. We should hope that God helps them and that they become better people if we really feel like there's a problem with where they're at. And, another passage I want to read that goes along with this, and this is kind of what I want to end on, is 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. And I think that this is something that, we really need to keep in mind in these settings. And I mean, really, even just in general, if we're dealing with somebody that, we're not a huge fan of for one reason or another. But, starting in verse 20, it says, "If a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? And this commandment have we from him, that he who loveth God loveth his brother also." And so I think that when we feel so much bitterness and division in these political settings, maybe we feel like we're leaning towards the party or group that has it right. Or, maybe we feel like somebody else is wildly wrong in their views or what they're doing in office or whatever it is. We need to strive to have love for those people, and we should genuinely make it about seeking the truth and praying for others. And I think we really need to keep this verse and this passage in mind. And I think, again, we ultimately need to realize that, all of us have fallen short in some way. And I think that we need to take, as believers, I think we need to really think about the grace God has given us and how He's transformed us, what He's offered us. And we should take that gratitude we feel to say, you know what, I hope that everybody finds this. And I hope God, gives me the opportunity to be able to share this in a loving and constructive way with others so that they can experience that too. And so, hope this video was helpful. Again, I know the subject could be kind of controversial, but I hope that it was meaningful. And until next time, God bless.